In this episode, we look at some ideas to keep in mind when you write up Chapter 2 or the literature review of your study. Students often find the literature review overwhelming. Where to start, what to include, and what to leave out. There is often confusion between having too little information to report on and having too much. What is important to note is that Chapter 2 has a main claim or an argument. It is the golden thread that runs throughout this chapter. We will now view a discussion between Prof. Henning and Dr. Sonja Brink on how she approached Chapter 2 in her PhD.
Sonja, I read your PhD thesis and I was quite intrigued by your extensive study of the literature. How in the world did you do it?
Thank you, Albie. Well, actually, at the start I was really overwhelmed. I actually did get lost a couple of times, but then I drew a little map and I found myself again. So yes, because there were these different tiers of linguistics that I had to look at, social linguistics, psycholinguistics, and then applied linguistics, I decided to take the reader from the broader to the more specific. So I started with social linguistics and language policy in South Africa, how that changed, and I unpacked that, all the while keeping in mind the status of Afrikaans as language of the oppressor, and the status of Setswana as not the language that you use to learn academically.
Okay.
Then I had a look at the demography of languages in South Africa, and I looked at the various models of bilingualism and how those get implemented in schools in South Africa. From there, I moved on to psycholinguistics and how it is that children learn to read. Then I realized that I would have to split this into two. And this is just the way that the path went for me. I started off on a path, and then I realized, but it is not a matter of choosing one path over the other. I'm going to have to walk one path and then actually walk the other path too, and then let them converge so that I end up with one road that the reader can read.
How did you bring all of this together in a logical flow?
Well, Prof, I actually did sit down and just create a couple of possible mind maps, and then I have to say I probably did quite a number of those. So because I was dealing with this dual construct of language and then the function of language called reading, it would have been very easy just to leap in and start reading about reading. But because I had teased it out and I had dealt with language and language in education and language in society and the value that we put to certain languages for certain purposes, for example, in the value of English as a means to enter the job market. After having done all of that, I went down to the more local level of having a look at how language affects the reader, the young reader. And that part was my psycholinguistics in that chapter, because remember I split my chapter into two, which was really very liberating for me when I realized that I could do that. And it definitely took off that feeling of being so overwhelmed by this mass of literature that I had to read. So having split my chapter 2 into two, so to speak, with the language on the one hand and the applied linguistics on the other, because what I really wanted to get to, Prof, remember, is that I really wanted to get to phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, and orthographic depth.
Did you get there?
Eventually I did.
Okay.
But it helped me that I could tick off this chapter 2, what was then chapter 2, and move on to a fresh chapter in which I would be addressing the real crux, the nuts and bolts of my study.
Which were?
which were, I started off with phonemic awareness, the meaning of the word and how it linked to early literacy and how it affected early literacy, but all the time keeping in mind that I'm talking
Yeah.
about two languages here.
Yeah.
So how does phonemic awareness in Setswana, because phonemic awareness starts at home, how does that translate to phonemic awareness in Afrikaans? And what, as you know, Prof, what I really wanted to get to then was how the Afrikaans orthography was the ideal vehicle for Setswana-speaking children to learn to read in, because of the close link or relationship, if you will, between phonemes in Setswana and phonemes in Afrikaans.
Hawena, you speak Setswana, you studied Setswana-speaking kids, and I would like to hear what you can say about that in Setswana. But will you do that? Ganyani.
Ganyani, ganyani. O kare, fa ngwana o itse medumo a Setswana, a ka itse medumo a Afrikaans gore di a tswana tota.
Batho.
So,
Ke a leboga mosisi.
go leboga nna.
So it must have been quite hard. So these kids come to school, you studied them, you had all this literature, and out of that literature you came to a type of claim that you could make just from having studied literature. What was that claim? About learning to read in a language which isn't your home language, the sounds of which you don't yet know that well, but on the other hand, they do have some sounds that you recognize because you board Setswana.
Because I was Setswana. Yes, Prof. Actually, it was this whole experience of writing the chapter 2 and of reading the chapter 2, because one jumps the gun and think that I'm going to write my chapter 2. But you actually read your chapter 2, and what I really learned doing the chapter 2 for my PhD as opposed to my master's, for my master's I wrote my chapter 2. And for my PhD, I realized that I'm not only reading it and writing it, this is part of my research. It's not a standalone module. It's not a standalone little thing and then I'm going to try and see how I integrate it. It really was part of my research, and you're quite right. The fact that even through reading, I realized that there are so many links between the two languages, and specifically links that pertain to early reading, that it really became an integral part of my research itself. And that gave me, it took quite a while, but that gave me a feeling of being empowered and I can do this.
Okay, now that you're a postdoctoral research fellow, did you take anything with you about your PhD?
Oh yes, Prof, I did. I never, ever think of literature as something that I read and write about afterwards. I always see literature as a potential for actually being part of the research, because one thinks that you do your chapter 2 and then it's tick, done, and I can move on to chapter 3, 4 and 5. But actually, it's a circular process, and one goes back and one goes back. And what my PhD in that huge chapter 2, and which turned out to be chapter 2 and 3, really did for me was to make me really comfortable with that process, not to be afraid, to think, no, wait a minute, but let me just go back and see what else there is, and to let that continuously inform my process.
That's excellent, iterative work. Well done, Sonia.
Here are some important facts when you write up your literature review.
A study of the literature is sometimes referred to as a literature review. In this part, you are locating your study within the body of literature that is relevant to your study. Such a study serves multiple purposes. Firstly, it shows that you are aware of who the leading researchers are, and you can locate your work by doing this. You then also show that you know the typical methods that are used for certain topics. In the course of a study, a student may read numerous articles, book chapters, reviews, reports, and blogs. While doing this, it is important to keep an annotated record of everything you have read. We have found it very helpful to use a specific type of matrix which comprises of essential annotated information. There should, for instance, be columns for the authors, publisher, date, pages, publication type, main claim, methods, and findings. We also encourage students to make their own notes of important aspects of the source material and not to simply highlight text. Highlighting leads to unfocused reading. However, you don't simply describe what you have found. A high-quality study of the literature is easily identified. It is logical, it is argumentative, it is coherent, and it flows cohesively. It is not a collection of information consisting of a list of authors and the results of their studies. In Chapter 2, one should have a definitive argument and counter-argument coming from the literature. A study of the literature is not only about what other researchers have found in their studies, it is also about the methods they used, the problems they encountered, the puzzles that they had not solved, and the gaps that they had identified in the literature. Currently, no student will begin a study without using software to capture all references. If you do not use software to help you organize referencing, and if you try to do this manually, you are bound to regret it.
Here are some students who give a short synopsis of how they approached Chapter 2 and some of the theorists who informed their chapter.
The scope of my literature has to do with the development of science concepts in young children. I'm looking at scholars who have investigated science concepts, more particularly for my study, the observational astronomy and vitalistic biology.
Some of my anchor authors were from the Finnish literature, Salberg, Lavunen, Niemi, and from South Africa, Janssen and Sayed.
The argument is the student teachers need to observe the mentor teachers in action so that they can be in a position to effectively assist the learners to manipulate the teaching tools.
I argued that innovation in a teacher education practicum could contribute to the development of a signature pedagogy for teacher education.
I am arguing that in order for teachers to teach science adequately in the foundation phase, they first need to know what it is that the children know about science phenomena.
Most of the literature that I've read addresses the international context, and there's nothing that addresses the South African context. Moreover, with the knowledge that a teacher in a teaching school should possess.
In the South African context, I haven't come across a literature that addresses mentor teachers, engaging with student teachers to create teaching tools that learners can manipulate.
Currently, we do not know much about what South African children in the early grades of the primary school know about natural phenomena.
We know very little about how students learn in primary school practice.